All right, so with that, I'm going to introduce our speaker. I've known him all my life. He's currently the Senior Director of Analytics and Search Discovery. I want to give him plenty of time to share his amazing insights. So with no further ado, I will turn it over to, let's give it up for Tim Wilson. Yeah, suckers. Okay. And I don't need notes, so those were my notes for the first part. So, also did not think to find the clicker, so this will be interesting. All right. Did you hear that? Okay. It's not going to blow. So, okay, so we're going to talk about data visualization tips and tricks. I turned out, so we're in November 2018. I'm a fan of the Venn diagram, so those of you who are long-time Web Analytics Wednesdays attendees, I do occasionally wind up presenting. And back in March of 2015, I actually did a building dashboards using Microsoft Excel. There's a little bit of overlap with that content tonight. I realized over the weekend, as I was kind of finalizing my content for this, that I had to dig deep into SlideShare, but I gave in September of 2010, did a session on data visualization and dashboard design. So I'm looking around the room. There are only a handful of people who might have been there in September of 2010. There is some repeating material, content. If it looks like totally like you already know something, then I'm just going to assume that's because somewhere I seeded it in the community in September 2010, and you're welcome. So, but we'll dive in. And I want to start with what kind of frustrates me when I talk to an analyst who says, why are you talking about data visualization? I am an analyst. I crunch the numbers, I build the models, I am deep in kind of the mechanics and the science and the engineering of the data, and you're asking me to use the complete opposite side of my brain and be like artistic and creative and make stuff that's pretty. And that's not it at all. When we're talking about data visualization in a business context, it's all about science. It's really not about being creative or having an eye for aesthetics or having studied art history. It really is all about science. It's specifically about neuroscience. And if you think about it, it's about neuroscience because what we're trying to do when we're doing data visualization, what we're really trying to do is get the information we're presenting through the pupil of the person we're presenting to and back into their brain where it is available for recall. And there's been an enormous amount of research into how the brain works and how we can do that. And learning kind of what's going on there is actually really all we need to do to apply to do more effective data visualization. So we're going to have a brief little lesson in neuroscience, and then we'll move into some specific tips. So one thing that neuroscientists have sort of figured out is that we basically have three types of memory. And we can kind of think of them as a funnel. But the first one we have is called iconic memory, or sometimes it's called the visual sensory register. If you think about the test for your peripheral vision where you hold your thumbs out to both sides and move them in until you can see it, that's your field of view. And that is images flowing into your eye all the time and being processed precognitively. So this is where pre-attentive or precognitive processing occurs. But as long as your eyes are open, you're taking in an enormous amount of visual stuff and ignoring most of it. So that precognitive, if I'm looking this way and a big flash of light happens right over there, it's going to first hit my iconic memory that's going to say, you need to look over there and pay attention to that. But everything happening in iconic memory is before we're actually thinking about it. A tiny little fraction of that visual stuff makes it through iconic memory into short-term memory. And short-term memory is where cognition starts to happen, where we start actually thinking about what am I looking at, what am I perceiving and digesting. This is crazy. Like there's like a gerbil that eats the HDMI cables here, because this is a different HDMI cable than the one that had glitches for months on this. So in short-term memory, the key thing about short-term memory is that it has a very, very, very limited capacity. So it's debated exactly how much it can store, but generally like 3 to 9 chunks of information is all that we can hold in short-term memory and process at one time. So if you're looking at a very, very busy dashboard, you can't actually take it all in at once. You have to shift around and focus on different parts of it. So what's happening in short-term memory, we're trying to decide, is this important? Does this matter? Should I actually pass this information into my long-term memory? And long-term memory could be 5 minutes from now, 15 minutes from now, 5 months from now. So think of this like the marketing funnel, that we have an enormous amount of signals coming in constantly, and only a tiny little bit is actually going to get logged in long-term memory. And when we're communicating information, that's what we want. We don't really want to just stand up and talk to people for a while and have them walk out and say, I can't recall a damn thing. So when we're doing data visualization, what we're really trying to do is reduce the cognitive load at each one of those steps, because the brain has to process everything. Somewhere along those steps, it has to decide, does this matter, does this not matter, what matters, and should I pass along to the next step? So fundamentally, that is like literally the theme of this entire presentation, is thinking about how can we, with effective data visualization, reduce the cognitive load on our audience or our stakeholders. So we're going to do a little bit of audience participation. It's going to be really fun if this is glitching. But what I want you to do is count how many 5s are in this list. And there's no trick. There's not some special pattern to the numbers. It's just kind of scan through it. And you don't have to be perfect. Give plus or minus 1. Blur it out once you think you've got a decent guess. Look at Doug in the back saying 5. 3, 4, 5, 6. So it is actually 6. But think through what you had to do to actually process it. What if instead I said how many 5s are in this list? So it's a really, really simple example, assuming that I'm not trying to trick you, right? If I'd buried other 5s, and if you know I'm trying to communicate information effectively, think about how much less actual thought you had to do to get the number of 5s here. So that's kind of an arbitrary example. It came from a book, one of my favorite books on this whole subject, which I'll have at the end. But let's look at a more practical or more kind of relatable example. And let's take a default Excel chart. Now, I don't think anybody here would actually produce this Excel chart. You would do something to it. But let's take that kind of default Excel chart and think through what the brain actually has to do subconsciously, but a lot of little cycles we have to run through. The brain has to say, this border around this chart doesn't matter. I can ignore that. Same thing for the shadow that's dropped on this. I can ignore that. Angled text. We, on the Western world, read top to bottom, left to right, horizontal. So our brain is having to rotate and then process what's actually going on there. So there's just a little mini cycle that the brain has to do that is just trying to understand what the chart is showing. Same thing for rotated 90 degrees. That's not any better. We still have to kind of rotate it horizontally before we can comprehend it. These kind of grid lines, they matter. They're kind of useful registers, but we have to recognize that, those are just kind of reference lines. They're not really that important. Month. Well, wait, we know it's the month because we already had to rotate the text and we figured out it was month. Hopefully, tools that default put a legend when there's only one value. Sometimes we need a legend. We don't need it in this case. It's already in the title. So all of that is stuff that our brain has to work through and decide is unimportant. So there's a lot of cognitive load that's happening there. If we just use this chart, then hopefully you're looking at that saying, yeah, that is a lot easier to comprehend. What we've done is stripped away a lot of stuff that the brain has to think about and discard and ignore. So we've kind of removed all of that cognitive load. We're going to come back to this example very quickly because most of what I just did there was applying one very simple tactic, which is my favorite data visualization tactic. So that's kind of the setup for what we're going to talk about. But now we'll get into kind of specific tips of how to actually, what can I do when I'm making a chart or presenting information that will make it easier and faster to comprehend. And the first one is a little bit of a mouthful, but how many people have heard of Edward Tufte? Okay, so kind of data visualization guru. How about Stephen Few? People know Stephen Few? So he's kind of my hero. So Edward Tufte, super entertaining, brilliant guy, writes great books, does great presentations, but he's kind of academic, but in the world of kind of data visualization and information communication. Stephen Few takes a lot of Tufte's concepts and says, how do we actually apply this in the business world? And so Tufte has a thing called the data ink ratio. Stephen Few said, yeah, we're not using a lot of ink. I mean, they're laser printers. Well, no, we're actually looking at a lot of stuff on screen. So the idea behind maximizing the data pixel ratio is that when looking at a visualization or a report, every non-background pixel is either a data pixel, it's actually a representation of data, or it's not. It's structural or decorative or organizational. And so maximizing the data pixel ratio is taking the number of data pixels and dividing it by all of the non-background pixels. And you want that number to be as high as it can be. Really kind of confusing concept. I still love it because it sounds fancy, but I used to work with a lady named Michelle Kiss, and she and I would do some training on this sort of topic. And she would say, Tim, why don't you just tell people to pretend their printer's running out of ink? Turns out it's equally as effective. If you're pretending, whether you're going to print this thing or not, that you're going to print it and say, let me pretend I have to minimize the amount of ink that I'm using, I'm going to only keep the stuff that really, really matters and represents the data. So if we go back to our chart and we look at the kind of before and the after, that has been mostly what was applied here. So we've taken a lot of, if you look at the pixels on the right image and say what percentage, what portion, you don't actually calculate it, are actually representing the data. So a lot of even backing up the grid lines and saying, let's make those a lighter gray. Let's, instead of writing out the entire month, let's just put 3 letters and let's make them, we need them there for organization. We can't get to a 100% maximization of the ratio. But this, to me, is like if everybody just applied this one concept, and I will promise you what will happen if the next chart you make, save it, and then say, now I'm going to go and try to apply that whole maximizing the data pixel ratio, you'll wind up with a chart that looks better. Save that off, keep practicing it, come back to that chart like in 3 months, and you'll be like, oh man, I didn't go far enough. I could have dropped even more stuff out. And you'll wind up with stuff that is much cleaner and easier to read, unless you're presenting on a kind of shaky projector and maybe the gray got just a little bit light. If only I'd ever seen this projector before, I wouldn't have made that mistake. So it doesn't have to be just for charts. This works for like tables of numbers as well. Our tendency is to say, I want to make this more polished. I want to present it more effectively, so I start adding things. Let me invert the heading. Let me put some nice heavy border lines around it. What we're doing is we're adding non-data pixels. If instead we say, let's back things off. We don't need the vertical lines. We need the headings, but they're not super important. They just need to be registered. So let's make those maybe a little bit lighter, or make them a color. Definitely the vertical lines, even the horizontal lines are useful for the eye to be able to guide them along, but they shouldn't be competing with the actual values and the data. And we're going to come back to this table in a bit as well, because this still, reading tables of numbers is high on the cognitive load front. So it's a federal law that you cannot give a presentation on data visualization without deriding pie charts. So I don't want to get deported back to my native Southeast Texas. I don't know. So pie charts are generally evil, and and most people probably have heard that, but let's think about it from some of the cognitive load that has to happen when we're working with a pie chart. A really big one here is that our eyes have to bounce back and forth between the individual wedges and the legend to actually read what this chart is saying. So think about how much your brain is having to try to process and store to actually interpret this. It's also, humans were terrible at assessing area. Comparing areas, 2 dimensions, we're terrible at it. Stephen Few has some good examples in his books where he's like, oh, how much bigger is this circle than that circle? And guaranteed you'll be off. So, and that's a lot of cognitive load for us to try to figure that out. In most cases, if instead of a pie chart, a horizontal bar chart works way, way better. I'm not relying on color here. My eyes aren't bouncing back and forth. I'm just kind of reading it top to bottom as I'm used to reading something. Now, the astute audience member may be saying, I think I could have removed some things from that bottom chart and maximized the data pixel ratio farther. What possible value come from those little tick marks? Those are kind of annoying. And if you're not feeling that way, you will after you practice, because it really annoys me that we've got tick marks. I'm actually kind of bothered by the blank screen. that even this horizontal line isn't really particularly useful. You could probably even say, do I need even these numbers at all? I've labeled the chart. I could probably take all that away. The reason I include it is because I realized that I've been beating this drum for a really long time. These two images come from a blog post I wrote in 2009, which was a year before I did the presentation at a Web Analytics Wednesday. But at the time, I knew about maximizing the data pixel ratio, and still I missed a few things that could have made that chart easier to read. So since 2009, 2010, vendors, BI tools, your web analytics platforms have realized that people hate pie charts. And so they've come up with, product managers, designers have come up with one solution where they're like, we get it, pie charts are bad, so we'll do donut charts. I'm like, are you kidding me? At that point, I'm not sure what we're doing, because I don't know if it's the length or the area. And literally, I converted this. I don't have the original underlying Excel file for that. I drew a white circle on top of it, and I made it a donut chart. So that's a problem. But the other thing to say about the horizontal bar chart is even though a bar is technically area, when we're looking at bar charts, we're comparing length. So we're only working in one dimension, and it's much, much easier for us to process that. So donut charts are also pretty awful. So does that mean never use pie charts? Yes. Like once every 18 to 24 months, I use a pie chart. So if you've only got 2 or 3 sections, then Fox News is like famous for like doing things like having pie charts that add up to 120%. So yeah, don't do that. They should be parts of the whole. It should be representing the right thing. But this pie chart actually is got a really, really big problem. I don't know if we have enough people here. If there's any dude who's like saying, are you the guy who's actually seeing you know what that is? Yeah. So 9 to 10% of US males have deuteranopia. I almost got that right. So I had to fiddle around with the greens and reds a little bit to make it this bad. But I've talked to people who've had like their manager who they were going in saying red and green. They're presenting reports to him, and finally the manager was like, you realize I can't actually understand this. And so you have to be really, really careful. So the guide with color is don't ever use, if you can possibly avoid it, don't make color the requirement to interpret a visualization. Use color to maybe augment. We'll see examples of that in a minute. But there's a risk. If you're sending something out, if a large number of people are going to be seeing it, you have to be careful that you're sending out things that they can actually interpret. There is, for Mac users, there's a little free app called Sim Daltonism. You guys know that? It's like you can flip through all the different types of colorblindness and just move it over your screen and see what how they'll see it. Even if you're like, no, I've checked, I know all my coworkers, they have no color blindness involved at all. Well, do they have any black and white color printers? Because if you actually provide an amazing report or visualization, what if they're hopping on an airplane and therefore decide they're going to print it out real quick, and the black and white printer in their office is the easiest thing to print it on? So you have to be careful, and we're adding that cognitive load as they're like trying to actually interpret it. So I do love horizontal bar charts. I use them kind of all the time because they're just so easy to read. You can make them really compact. And some other things I like to do with horizontal bar charts, this is great for one metric, but what if I have a couple of metrics and I want to compare them side by side? Well, horizontal bar charts make that pretty easy as well. I don't have to repeat my categories, my dimension. I can put them right next to each other, and hopefully you're looking at this saying, my eye is kind of going right to that, what the hell is that one channel that just sucks? And it's display, because display pretty much always sucks. But that's giving very low cognitive load. But here's where we can use color. If that's really the point we're making, if this isn't a dynamically designed, they're going to be exploring it, if we're actually presenting, maybe it is being presented on a slide, well, then we can start bringing in a color and accent. Say, this is what I actually want you to talk about or actually think about. So what we're doing is we're guiding the eyes. We're removing the decisions. We're making it that much of a faster track to what actually matters here. Let me make that pop. And you guys know you could like jump in and interrupt me at any point, I assume, if I took a breath. Okay. So another awesome aspect of horizontal bar charts, and I forgot to say, everything I'm showing so far applies to kind of any tool: Excel, Google Sheets, Tableau, Domo, Click, Data Studio. So we'll get to some that are a little more tool specific, but for the most part, these are just general principles that all of the tools support, even if they don't default to it. So when it comes to tables of numbers, there is a lot of cognitive load going on here because we actually have to read the numbers. Not so much for sessions, because there's this nice little thing about the sessions column and that the longer numbers have more digits. So if you think about it, they're kind of acting like little reverse bar charts. But if we wanted to see this horrible bounce rate for display, we actually have to read the numbers and process them. So it's like back to that very, very first little example we did. You actually have to focus and read them as opposed to just being able to see kind of the key piece of information jump out at you. So instead, we can put horizontal bars inside a bar chart. So if you're Google Sheets, this is with the Sparkline formula. With Excel, it's with conditional formatting. It's actually easier to do like an accent color with Google Sheets than it is with Excel, but it can be done. I don't like Excel gives you the option to say use conditional formatting and put the labels and the bars in the same cell. That's not good from a cognitive load because your brain has to actually figure out the two. This is just two columns. So this is a column with my actual where the data is coming from. This is a column that just says equal the cell right to the right. I can drag it down. I do conditional formatting in that column and turn off the labels. So super easy to do and very compact. I made the rows a little bit taller just because to spread things out and not make them quite as dense. But that's not that much, not taking that much more real estate than the original, and it's much, much, much easier to comprehend. Quick one, use plain English. I get really annoyed with analysts who are like, well, but it was I just exported from Google Analytics and that was the medium value. I'm like, yeah, but do all your stakeholders just intuitively see CPC and know that's paid search? They may know it, but why make them think about it? Spend the time to make your labels be as intuitive as possible to your audience. I was throwing a data source. That's barely a data visualization thing, except it's Tim's pet peeve, so I can't not say throw it in. Be mindful of maximizing the data pixel ratio. It's not data, so make it light, make it small, put it in the bottom. Might not even be seen. Somebody may ask you, like, where did this data come from? And you can say, oh, it's in the little footnote there. And then they'll know. They'll know from that point forward, but it's not going to be distracting. So there are a few things wrong with this chart. I'm not going to make that a big question. The one I want to focus on is the too many significant digits in our labels. And this is where I'll give Google Sheets a little bit of a knock because they make it kind of hard to fix that. If you want to have 2 decimal places in the chart, you kind of have to jump through some hoops to remove those extra zeros. But you can do it, and it's a little small thing. So, but it's keeping people from looking at it and really keeping people from thinking that you're a false sense of accuracy when you're just presenting something that's really precise. So we flip to a vertical chart here, and should it be 2.13 or should it just be 2.1? It's an A/B test. It shows that I've got this perfect value. There are times where adding cognitive load is good. And if you're in kind of the optimization world, you see these numbers, you see a % lift, but hopefully you realize that it's just a sample. That's not necessarily any total truth. And there are ways to add little things. Well, this is a way it could maximize the data pixel ratio. But I can add error bars. I like adding little error bars because even if people don't really fully think through, like, well, what exactly is that? Is that plus or minus 2 standard errors? Are you approximating a 95% confidence interval? I don't care if they think that, but I do say that will draw their eyes to it. If everything else is kind of minimized, they'll say, you're telling me this is where it is, but you're telling me you have some uncertainty in the data. That's a good cognitive load because I'm getting them to understand that they can't take this as the truth forever and forward, that if they roll out this change, it will be exactly 2.51% of a conversion rate. I'm actually adding cognitive load very, very selectively because I want them to stop and actually think about, okay, there's some variability in this. When you're telling me that these are different numbers, but you haven't achieved a 95% confidence level, what does that mean? Well, let me show you. There are big error bars, and there's a lot of variability. So we've kind of bar and column charted ourselves to death. So we'll hit one don't really know exactly where to fit this in, but I love Sparklines. Used to be, back in the day, doing Sparklines in Excel was make a really small chart and turn everything off. They were like, it was painful, really frustrating. You're trying to align stuff. But Excel, Google Sheets, Tableau, Data Studio. This example is actually Data Studio uses Sparklines. So again, we're adding a little bit of cognitive load, maybe, but if we put just a number, we're potentially hiding the fact that there was a huge spike or there was a big trend going upward. So because with Sparklines, a lot of time, if you have a sea of them, the pattern kind of repeats with all of them, which means it can get tuned out very easily, and then when there's a big jump or a big anomaly, that actually kind of pops out and comes to the fore, because we sort of see a recurring pattern and say, got it, everything's kind of processing is normal, I mainly care about the numbers. So I love me some Sparklines. So I am going to do one Excel tip. So this was, for those of you who were here in 2015 and just repeat, I'm sorry. No, I don't really think people hang on my words that much. But this is something I tried, and I thought it was going to bite me in the ass, and then I realized, looked up like 3 or 4 years later, and I'd been doing it, and nobody else was talking about it, and it was super, super useful. So I kind of like to share it, even though I don't work in Excel all that much anymore. So this is part of an Excel dashboard. And I kind of loved it when I would present stuff to clients and they would say, what tool? Was that Tableau? I wish we need to get Tableau. I'm like, no, this is just Microsoft Excel. The trick with this, and that's got a decent amount of layout. And the trick here is that I will take Excel and make all of the columns very narrow. So I basically give myself a design grid, which is a much more flexible design grid than Analysis Workspace offers. Then there are some web-based tools. And then I work within that grid. And so if I figure out what kind of widget, so this is kind of purely for dashboards, if I have the design of what elements I want to include on it, I'll just sit there and merge cells and get everything laid out just once, and then I can just copy and paste that wherever I want, update the formulas, and put additional metrics. Wouldn't be a big deal. It wouldn't be as useful if that was the only element that I had. But what if I'm actually mixing up and I want to have kind of a 3 and 2 layout? Well, if you think about how Excel works, if you haven't done something, you start getting all this, jumping through all these hoops trying to figure out how can I engineer the width of these cells, only merge these cells here and not these cells here. If you just make them all narrow, turn off your grid lines, the user never knows, and you can do all sorts of things. These are all various automated or semi-automated. This one kind of I lived with and it lasted the longest. As far as I know, they're still using it, but it kind of pulls out the example. Those top 6 were kind of their KPIs-ish, but if you look at the next set of data, it's got a different structure. It's got headings on the side and then 4 things. It would have been really hard to do that if I didn't have some way to have flexibility in the layout. This was actually a 2-page dashboard. If you scrolled farther down, we got to yet a completely different layout. So this had a lot of information packed into it. It was a small set of 7 or 8 stakeholders, and they got to where they liked it the first time they saw it, but it was dense. Then they got used to reading it, and then it would pop out. We were using color, red and green, but it was off an index line. So the color would draw people who didn't have a red-green color blindness. It would kind of help them further, but even those who did, they could still easily see the stuff that was going very negative or very positive. And heavy use of those horizontal bars, because I love them. So everything except for that Excel tip, pretty much any tool that applies to, you totally could do it in Excel or Google Sheets. But there are all these other visualizations out there. And I was kind of I still am, I get nervous when people do exotic visualizations just for the sake of visualizing in a different way, just to make it pretty. No, we should be focusing on what are we trying to represent and how do we represent it. So there are things beyond a pie chart, a line chart, and a bar chart. And there are tools out there to help us figure out what is the right chart for the job. This one's been around, I think, since 2009, although it looks like it's been around since like 1907. I know I had it printed out at some point. I've never made it past the first box because I get tripped up on whether the data I'm looking at, what the difference is between a comparison and a relationship, or a composition and a relationship. So I never managed to actually follow it. I kind of get the idea, But I kind of look at it and think, well, why don't we just pay attention to what kind of visualizations are out there and then try to find the right visualization for the job? And I kind of question, I can't imagine people saying, oh, I've got some data, let me go follow my little tree. It got modernized. Juice Analytics has their interactive, same idea, but it's web-based. You can click on it, comparison or distribution, it'll filter down. Maybe that works. I've never actually found much value in having those tools, outside of maybe saying, yeah, I probably should know what a waterfall chart does or what a bubble chart does. It'll come up. It will emerge when it is the right visualization for the job, but I don't think I'm going to find it through a chart chooser. But if you're a chart chooser kind of person, there's resources out there for you. So I thought I'd walk through some that maybe are a little tougher to do in a spreadsheet world, and this is where you do start kind of get drawn into a Power BI or a Tableau or R. This is actually done with R. But tools that actually do have more flexible visualization. Boxplots, or box and whisker charts as they're called, definitely adding cognitive load. Most business stakeholders don't intuitively understand what they're seeing in a box plot. But if what's really matters is I want you to compare these things, but I want you to understand the degree of variability in the data, that's what a box plot is really good for. And they can be rotated either way, but they show the median, the box shows the second and third quartiles, the whiskers, kind of the endpoints, and sometimes they don't have the little tails on them. Those show the first and fourth quartiles, and then usually there's a calculation that says we don't want to overly inflate those, so we'll actually calculate some outliers and say we're going to put those outside the quartiles. But it's a good way, and they're starting to show up a little bit more, is a good way to kind of show where is this data kind of centered around and then how much variability is occurring in it. I kind of love heat maps. The screen does not. This is probably way more distracting for you guys than me. I'm probably half the time it's been blank and I've been talking about it. You guys are like, it's a great point you're making there, cowboy. So heat maps, but I will say heat maps generally try to stick to the monochromatic because density, you're in good shape. If somebody's printing out black and white, if they've got a colorblind issue, you look at red to green, even if you're you better make sure the red really means bad and the green means good, as opposed to a level from a 0 to density. But they start looking like Christmas trees, and they're kind of hard to interpret. This isn't the most awesome example, but last week I did a different presentation, and a coworker asked me, "Hey, I want to see when Gary Vaynerchuk tweets." And what came out of it was, holy crap, Gary Vaynerchuk tweets all the damn time. Literally all the damn time. So heat maps are nice. This one, you kind of look at it. Again, there's some cognitive load on this one. There's nothing really popping up other than the fact that Friday he seems to be heavied up a little bit, although this is only like 3 or 4 weeks of data because the guy's a machine and needs to stop drinking Red Bull. But heat maps can also be useful if we do have to provide tables of numbers. I've done this. Hey, just send me the data. Well, let me just throw some conditional formatting on it real quickly. And now I'm actually giving you some clues because every one of you just looked down here and said, what the hell's going on there? Oh, it's email. You must have just dropped an email. So that's a way to add information that really helps the user perceive it. If they said, I need a big table of numbers, then it's kind of a pseudo heat map. And again, sticking with sort of a monochrome. I think this green's actually a little too bright, but you get the idea. Scatter plots can be awesome. We're trying to show the relationship between, yes, doctor?
On your heat map, are you doing that manually in Excel, or is there a special package you're using?
So this happens to be a ggplot2 visualization, but you can totally, with Excel, with the conditional formatting, like it's actually easier to do in Excel. You just pick which gradient you want to, what's on the low, what's on the high. And as well as Google Sheets has that as well. So scatter plots, sometimes they're good just to check that the data is behaving reasonably. They can be good to say what's the outlier, what are the ones that actually jump out because they're really, they break what sort of correlation I have. I want to visualize what kind of correlation there is between 2 metrics. So it's good. Scatter plots are, I want to look at visits and orders and see if that goes goes wonky on one particular, on Black Friday, maybe it flies off the chart. The sessions go way up and revenue doesn't track with it. Kind of hard to interpret, but again, you can use color. If you say, really what I want to talk about is, this one guy. Well, it's easy enough. Go and put a circle around it. Draw the eye to that, and then tell the story from there. I like word clouds. People love word clouds or hate word clouds. I actually hate poorly done word clouds. Word clouds where somebody says, let me take all of the searches on my site that included the word boots and do a word cloud with those search terms. And guess what the most dominant word, dominates everything, is boots. Because what the hell were you thinking? Of course. And this is where it gets a little tougher in Excel, but using another tool, this is actually all of the followers of the Digital Analytics Power Hours Twitter account, and it's all of their descriptions, the descriptions that people had in their own descriptions. So we're followed by a lot of nerds, but doing a little bit of cleanup to say if I just made a word cloud, there'd be a whole bunch of junk in there. So let's remove all the stop words. And so now you need a tool that lets you easily remove the a, and, of, the, for, from, all of those words automatically. Let's remove the punctuation, remove the numbers, shove everything to lowercase so that we don't have capital analytics and lowercase analytics competing with each other. And then spit out a word cloud. And in this case, it's just kind of reinforcing that, yep, okay, that's our audience, is sort of who we'd expect it would be. Maybe I could dig in deeper and start doing bag of words or ngrams or kind of more advanced text mining. But word clouds, I think, work if we're clear on what sort of point we're trying to make, and if this actually, we understand what word clouds are telling us, so they can be a pretty low cognitive load. Same thing for geography. Excel now has geographic overlays, which is a reasonably recent addition. We need to be cognizant to make sure it's actually something worthwhile. I was kind of screwing around. This was showing where the followers of the Analytics Hour podcast Twitter handle were. Shocker, in the eastern part of the United States and in Europe, in the most densely populated areas. So a lot of times, geographic visualizations reflect urban density. Did you guys see the map of, the New York Times did it, that showed Hillary versus Trump, which one won by precinct, down to the super, super granular level. And you can kind of drill in. So you can go down to your precinct and see the degree to which it tilted one way or the other. What was interesting was that if you zoom back and looked at it, and it was blue and red, which may have some colorblindness issues, and somebody said, that actually looks exactly like a satellite view at night of the U.S., where the lights are denser in the urban dense areas. And you're like, oh, when these fancy political scientists tell us that urban areas lean left and rural lean right, it really kind of showed that. But that's kind of the risk with a lot of these geographic overlays. It can be useful if you say, I'm going to put interactivity on it. Now, I'm definitely upping the cognitive load, because for somebody to get something out of this, they actually have to start engaging with it. And we've got to be careful about that to make sure that if they're engaging, it's cognition, it's focus that's actually going to get them to finding something that they will store later. It's not just for the sake of moving stuff around. Again, can't really do that level of interactivity in Excel. Network diagrams are kind of my latest thing that I'm kind of loving. This one was it's given up the ghost. So this is kind of an interesting web analytics one. It's like the top 1,000 pages from a website, just looking at the traffic from the previous page to the next page, and then just doing a network diagram based on the volume of traffic just between two pages. So it's not a Sankey chart, which I'm not a big fan with, the flow charts in both Adobe and Google Analytics, which look cool for a demo, but then you're like, well, why does the main thing goes to the same page 3 times? Whereas this, if it reveals something, in this case, there's something going on with this site. I haven't actually figured it out yet. So I wouldn't actually stop with this one, but this was literally late last week. I'm like, oh, I got that visualization to work. It looks like there's some natural clustering of the content. But we have to be careful. Like, what's the point? Are we just making something pretty, or are we actually making a point? This one right now looks interesting, but it doesn't have a takeaway. But I do think network diagrams for social media, even for websites, have a lot of potential. And I'm going to bring it all home by reminding us that it's all really about just reducing the cognitive load for your audience. I've got 3 tips, 3 kind of recommended reading if you're interested in any aspect of this. Anybody else read Brain Rules by John Medina? Did I give that to my daughter to tell her to read yet? No? I will when you get home. So the premise of this book, John Medina is a neuroscientist, and he says, look, there's a ton of things we don't know about the brain, but I'm going to distill down in layman's terms 12 things that we do know about the brain. So it's fascinating. It's more broad than just data visualization, but it talks about how we actually take in information and store it. So it's a little more kind of theoretical, except it's really well written and really kind of makes you think about what we're doing when we're communicating this sort of information. Stephen Few, he's written a number of books. The one that I still think, just from because it's not too dense, Show Me the Numbers is a pretty hefty book, but Information Dashboard Design, it says it's a dashboard design book, and that's kind of an underlying part of it, but really what he's going throughout the entire thing is calling out how we actually communicate data visually. So it is much, much more broadly applicable than just dashboard design. And then another super tactical, this is, I think, the smallest book, was Donna Wong, who used to be the chief graphic person for the Wall Street Journal. And media, USA Today, Wall Street Journal, have had to often deal with black and white, communicate it clearly, communicate it simply, even if it's kind of dense information. Hopefully communicate it responsibly. And so this book is really like every page is like another tip, and it's a little thin book. And you flip through, but it actually talks about much more deeply than this presentation, some other kind of rule of thirds and these other things you can start to apply to just do little subtle things that at their core are all about reducing that cognitive load and increasing understanding. So I don't want our MC to be getting nervous that I'm going too long, because he'll get itchy about that. But so we'll do questions. I'm super contactable. I am horrible in presenting and remembering to like plug my podcast. So I was not plugging the podcast in 2010. I was plugging the blog in 2010. So things have changed. But I do a bi-weekly podcast with Mo Kiss in Sydney, Australia, and Michael Helbling in Atlanta. And we're taking our marketing game way up. So we do have stickers. So if you are or want to become a podcast fan and want a sticker, for any of you who are familiar with, anybody know Matt Gershoff? Heard of Matt Gershoff? Had your mind blown away by Matt Gershoff? I also have I've been Matt Gershoff stickers. So if you find that amusing and would like a sticker for that, please come see me. And we have, I don't know, an hour and a half for questions? No. We'll do like 5 or 10 minutes of questions and then let people refill on drinks. Any questions? Observations? So the word visualization tool, that was done with R and some simple text mining stuff that's available in R. Are there any Power Tableau users in here? Can you do word clouds in Tableau? You can do them in Domo, I think. But there's like it's weird that Wordle was like literally and that guy like stopped maintaining it like 7 years ago. I'm like, why has nobody come up with the next like Wordle replacement? Because it was awesome. It's just, you're like, oh, could we have this one little feature tweak? And it didn't, which is part of the reason, like with R, there's a word cloud package, and you can do kind of bake in sort of the data cleanup. So I kind of love doing that with site search terms, where I'll selectively take out words that I don't really care about. I'm like, oh, that's not telling me. Let me remove some of the words, regenerate the word cloud until I get to one that starts to be interesting.